Oh, there's a glove.
Oh, hello.
What's this?
We commission 4 artists to create a piece of work based on forgotten journeys of 4 19th century ships.
I read that there was precious cargo in the ship.
I mean, it was priceless.
So it's actually really heavy. I can't imagine wearing this on the wrist.
In this episode, we reimagine the Horatio, the ship that brought the first of over 2,000 convicts to Singapore.
They were often working in some pretty difficult conditions.
And we are reaping the fruits of their labor.
Hello, my name is Chloe Chotrani. I am a movement artist. So as a movement artist, I work on a very interdisciplinary level, from facilitating yoga classes to performing or choreographing for film or for theater. I love dancing. I've been dancing for almost all my life. When I was a young girl, it was a medium that I found very easily to express myself. And dancing as an art form also responds to what's happening in contemporary society. So it's very powerful and profound. Thank you. Madame, on the 18th of April, 1825, the ship Horatio sailed into Singapore, carrying on board the first convicts to ever arrive on these shores. It is your mission to revive the tale of this ship and her passengers, and to create a new work of art based on your discovery. Yours respectfully, the Commissioner. So I've never heard of the Horatio at all. I know that the convicts did do a lot of the hard labor to build the city. We talk a lot about colonial powers, but we don't think about the people who actually built the city with their own hands. So I'm definitely excited to learn more about these people. To shape my dance, I need inspiration. And for that to happen, I need information. Who exactly were these convicts, and why were they sent here? When I first heard about the Horatio, I actually don't know anything about it, so maybe you can share a little bit more?
We don't know very much about the Horatio, apart from the fact that its arrival here heralded the start of Singapore's history as a convict station. So in 1825, the Horatio came here, and the convicts would have disembarked near the mouth of the Singapore River.
So why were these convicts sent to Singapore specifically?
Singapore was a young colony, and the administration was perpetually cash-strapped. So convicts were seen as a cheap way to build up the colony.
John tells me early Singapore owed everything to the labor of convicts. They built buildings like the Istana and St. Andrew's Cathedral. They laid our first roads and constructed our earliest bridges. They were the ones who helped transform Singapore into its modern incarnation today. So who exactly were these convicts on the Horatio?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have much information, but what we do know was that there were 79 men and 1 woman on board.
Only 1 woman out of 80 on the Horatio.
There was only 1 woman.
Do you know anything about this one female?
I wish I did, but unfortunately, we know very little.
All John knows from the few records that exist is that she and the other 79 convicts were from the Indian province of Madras or Chennai. They had been serving their sentences in Bencoolen, Sumatra, before being transferred to Singapore. The women, along with 73 others, were serving out life sentences.
For a life sentence, many of these convicts would have committed violent crime. So robbery, murder, but beyond that, we don't really have much information about these convicts.
But John says that doesn't mean they should be forgotten.
We tend to mentally picture them as something like this, hardened criminals wearing leg irons. But the fact is, the convict population was actually quite diverse. They were from different stratas of society, from different ethnic groups all across India. and they often were here in very, very difficult conditions. The death rate was high, so we need to think about who they were as individuals and their individual lives, and I think our understanding of convicts would be much richer.
Speaking to John, it's almost shameful that we look down upon these convicts when we're reaping their benefits. And naturally, it made an impact on me knowing that there was only one woman on the ship. So I'm curious about her. I want to find out all I can about this woman. What was her life like as the first woman convict ever sent to Singapore? I am a movement artist, and I've been commissioned to create a new dance on the Horatio, the ship that brought the first batch of convicts to Singapore in 1825. So I'm thinking of telling the story of this one woman and the journey that she went through, from the ship to the arrival and maybe what her life was like. Dance to me can be deeply personal. I want to be able to step into the shoes of this woman, to see and imagine the life that she had lived. So first up, how was her journey to Singapore on the Horatio?
So these are some of the things that you would have found on board transportation ships. And this is, of course, the shackles. Yeah, these shackles would have been around their ankles. In the greater the offender, the more amount of shackles on him. Around his waist, around his arm, and then for some extending to the neck. I'm fascinated by it.
So it's actually really heavy. Yeah, and I can't imagine wearing this on the ankles and probably on the wrists.
That's right, and especially those who would have been charged for serious crimes. There was a practice of tattooing the crimes on their head.
Wow. So what were the conditions like on the Horatio for the convicts?
So they would be positioned not on the deck, below the deck. That's a very dark space. And they would be stuffed in.
Rajesh says that the Horatio wouldn't have been a large ship, and so the convicts would have lived in very crowded conditions, forced to eat, sleep, and defecate where they stood. So there was one woman out of all the men on the Horatio. Did she have different living conditions?
What I do know of is that she would have been positioned away from the men. But you must remember that the captain was the most powerful person on board ship. And while the records are quite silent about sexual exploitation of women, we know now that this would not have been uncommon.
And this, I learn, is not the last of the suffering she might have endured. There was also the trauma of being forced to cross the sea, a cultural taboo for many Indians at the time, especially Hindus.
They would perhaps forever be castigated by their family members and not allowed back. So in some ways, it was more than a singular punishment for them. It was not just about imprisoning somebody, but imprisoning them and making them break their social rules and norms.
Rajesh painted a really clear picture of their environment in the Horatio. Being the only female on that ship, it must have been a lot of suffering that she went through. It's quite a scary thing to confront. So most of the time they were in darkness. And they would also wear these shackles, which are very heavy.
So we can make in the soundscape this idea of metal clanging and walking with the shackle. We imagine one of the prisoners walking, shackle foot.
Rupak is a musician and my collaborator. And one of the first steps to choreographing this dance piece is to create the music. So Rupak and I are exploring different textures, a lot of from what I picked up with Rajesh, such as the sound of the shackles and bringing that in.
Do some clanking of keys, so you could just shake it around in the bowl. Perfect. Okay, so let's try to frame where in the composition that sound would come. So this is what we've got so far.
So based on Rupak's track, the choreography will come out of that, gets the spine of the dance film. I look forward to how it will be. I still don't know. Yes. But my research is still incomplete. I still need to find out the next chapter of the woman's story. What happened to her after arriving in Singapore? I'm really curious about what happened to the convicts. How did they live? What kind of work would they have been required to do?
So when they first arrived, like we might imagine them going into a prison, right? But actually, where they lived was much more sort of huts, you know.
More kampong style?
Yeah, and in 1825, you know, Singapore was a very small settlement. It had only been around for 6 years. So you've got to sort of imagine the vast majority of the islands being jungle, marshes, swamplands, like we're sitting in now.
Jessica says that these early convicts would have been sent to tame these wildlands. They would have filled the swamps with soil, cleared the jungles of trees, laid down the early road networks. Hard labor that essentially primed the island for the urban expansion to come. So what would it have been like for that one woman on the Horatio? Were the women treated differently?
They were treated very differently. And that was partly because the colonial officials didn't quite know what to do with women. They didn't see them as being good labourers. Often they did work like cleaning and sweeping.
And Jessica also adds that women tended to earn their freedom much faster than men.
They would usually achieve what was called a ticket of leave so that they could live outside the prison much earlier. So sometimes, you know, 3 or 5 years, whereas for men it could take up to 16 years.
Jessica explains that back in the 19th century, convicts were disciplined using a unique class system. New arrivals would be classed as hard laborers, but with good behavior, they could be promoted into convict officers that would supervise other convicts. And eventually, they could earn their tickets of leave and live as free men and women. So, do you think it was a successful system?
I think it's hard to say, really. British officials, they certainly thought it was an effective and successful system, but we don't know the perspectives of the convicts themselves, what this labour meant to them, what being in Singapore meant to them. So because of that, we don't have a full picture.
So it's just interesting to learn about the convict system, that they could actually work their way up and eventually earn their freedom. It was clear, though, that there was a large chunk of history that's been erased. And so it does make this project feel very meaningful, because I think it's also good to bring to our awareness what we don't hear and what's not being said. So based on all of these collective conversations that I've had so far, I've come up with 3 different chapters. The first being her journey in the Horatio and being in darkness. The second scene is labor, and imagining kind of the physicality that they were required to do. The last scene will be about liberation and freedom. The choreography for each chapter will have to be distinct from each other, and that's what I now have to figure out. There's an explosion. What do you think? I'm creating a dance piece about the story of the first woman convict to be sent to Singapore and the ship that brought her here, the Horatio. My friend Hashima and I are now working out the different kinds of movements for the 3 distinct chapters of the dance.
Whether there's a weight or whether you go up.
For the first scene, the movements will be more restricted and quite tense because she was probably in shackles and if it's very dark, so it's a lot of restrictive movement and a lot of held tension. Just kind of creating like shapes with the body.
Tension and release.
Yeah, tension and release. And the second scene for labor, it's more dynamic and also tired, but at the same time pushing your body because you need to survive. I'm looking at impulses that come from a sense of crawling.
And that maybe that primal instinct, it gave us strength to sort of pull through also.
Maybe play with physicality of almost hunting.
Animalistic, yeah.
Survival mode that you kind of have to snap into.
Yeah.
But the last scene, Liberation, is meant to be more emotive. And my research hasn't yet given me the emotional elements that I need. So I think a final layer that I'm still craving is a more personal element that strikes an emotional chord or maybe more specific information on a specific convict. There is one convict whose life has been documented more than others. And I meet with the woman who's dedicated her time to rescuing his story from the archives. I've met a few people already on this journey, and I'm looking for something more personal. So what have you found out about this individual?
So what we know is that his name was Kunuk Mistry, and he was sentenced for life in 1818 for larceny, which would mean burglary, it could be housebreaking. And in the 19th century, it was considered malicious enough to warrant a life sentence.
Vandana says that just like the convict woman, Kunuk Mistry was first banished to Bencoolen before being transferred to Singapore in April 1825.
And it's exactly 1 week after the first ship Horatio came here.
But unlike the woman, there are dozens of records detailing this man's life. Vandana shows me letters indicating that Kunuk Mistry had worked his way up into a convict of the first class, and that he served mostly as an assistant at a hospital.
So he worked very hard.
Wow.
And we have a whole series of letters from 1825 to 1857 vouching for his good behavior.
And Vandana reveals that it was Mistry himself who collected all these letters so that he could eventually petition for a free pardon in 1858, 40 years into his sentence.
He's just put it all together, and he also gives an emotional pull, when he says that as a Hindu, the punishment of transportation is more terrible than death, and the only consolation left is the hope of returning to die on the banks of his beloved Ganges. So Kunuk Mistry applied for a free pardon, which he got.
Do we know if he actually made it home?
We have no clue whether he ever went back to India.
Vandana suspects that Kunuk Mistry never left Singapore and continued to work in medicine as a native doctor till his death in 1865.
And I have a death notice from 24th of July 1865 which says, Kunuk Mistry, a liberated Bengali convict of considerable wealth, died on the 24th instant. It is very poignant to see that this man who worked so hard in Singapore, even in death, the tag of convict didn't leave him.
So I can feel that you're very connected to the story of Kunuk Mistry.
Oh, it's been very special. I find the whole story very inspirational. But it's unfortunate that people are not willing to talk about their forefathers who were convicts, which is really unfair. And we are reaping the fruits of their labor, and we have to appreciate them.
It was touching to meet someone who felt so deeply connected to this one convict that she's never met. It was very personal, and it's good to know that someone, at least one person, did change the course of his life. So Kunuk Mistry petitioned to travel back to India so that he could die by the banks of the Ganges. The idea of returning to the waters as a sense of death at the same time liberation, I find that to be a really beautiful closing for the dance film. So I'll apply it with the choreography, and the movements will be freer and fluid because she finally gets to do what she wills.
So this tempo is 104. I'm gonna put it down to 100.
Yeah, let's try that. I may never learn the life that the convict woman really lived. Her name, or if she died or became free. But I hope that my final work will be a fitting tribute for all that she and the convicts endured, and all that they gave to the city.